Hello, what's up everyone? In today's episode, I will talk about addiction recovery models in society today. I prefaced the transformational recovery model that I teach at Being True to You in the last episode. Before I dive deeper into this transformational recovery process, I will speak to the more conventional recovery models that we see today, mainstream focuses and milestones, and basic recovery principles and prerequisites. For most people, getting help for addiction means going to rehab. But this is an outrageously expensive and inconvenient way to get help, with a low return on investment, I must add, often leaving families in worse shape financially and emotionally. Additionally, just going to rehab, for instance, is not a solution. It is just a step in a much larger process. And the same goes for things like depression, anxiety, and insomnia. The go-to option is prescription medication. And although it can feel convenient in the moment, it is also not a solution and will just end up leading to more side effects and agony down the road. But there are some important fundamentals that we can draw from in regards to the mainstream recovery models in society today. Recovery work, it has a long and important history that has paved the way to where we are today. So whether a person does in fact need conventional treatment and medication in the moment or not, there are basic recovery principles and tips for everyone. So first, let's take a look at the top 6 mainstream recovery models. The evolution of recovery models developed over the last few hundred years through a fusion of addiction theories, recovery concepts, principles of change, and a process of trial and error. Recovery models developed to meet the needs of individuals and families based on what was known and available at that time, and were also heavily influenced by private interests and competing industries who were all trying to gain the monopoly on addiction treatment rights. There are strengths and limitations to each recovery model naturally, but all have contributed to where we are today. The first to mention is Alcoholics Anonymous. Stemming from the 1930s, AA, or generally known as 12-step fellowship groups, hold space for people to abstain from alcohol, their drug of choice, or their addictive behaviors by personally working through the 12-step model. The program includes attending community meetings, staying accountable to a sponsor, reading lessons from the Big Book, working through the 12 steps, and after 1 year of sobriety, helping others do the same. This process includes admitting powerlessness over the addiction, taking a personal inventory of oneself, making amends and righting wrongs, and turning things over to a higher power. Consistency, community, and collaboration are key principles. There are addiction recovery groups of many kinds worldwide. No cost or membership fees, no forced attendance, no formal or academic training, just people in long-term recovery helping people in new recovery to get and stay sober. Looking now at the Minnesota model. The most widely used model today by professionals is the Minnesota model, which was developed in 1949 by Pioneer House, Hazelton, and Wilmar State Hospital out of Minnesota. The model shifted addiction treatment away from medical institutions and criminal punishment and toward a more caring, nurturing, and compassionate model that sees addiction as a treatable disease. The model intertwines the 12-step recovery program with a 28-day inpatient program, facilitated by a combination of professionals and peer supports. The theory of recovery holds that addicted people need compassionate care. They need a safe place to rehabilitate. People need professional medical treatment, one-on-one support, and family and group therapy. People also need positive social connections, personal responsibility, and purpose and meaning. All right, now looking at the harm reduction model. The harm reduction methods were developed to both prevent and reduce harm and risk for individuals and communities without or with limited access to immediate solutions. The model focuses on reducing the most dangerous and risky behaviors first, followed by immediate action steps to improve a harmful or dangerous situation. When applied to addiction, the harm reduction model values helping people to manage and moderate their addictive behaviors as well as substance consumption, minimizing any associated dangers, risks, or consequences to themselves, their family, or the community at large. Now let's look at the recovery management model. This model was developed by William White, Michael Boyle, David Loveland, and Patrick Corrington of the Behavioral Health Recovery Management Project. The model changes the focus from treating short-term acute symptoms to helping individuals manage their long-term recovery. This theoretical model values long-term care incorporating pre-treatment, early reintervention, family and community involvement, peer support, education and coaching, and empowering the person. This model is often used in conjunction with inpatient and outpatient treatment or just in conjunction with addiction treatment counseling. Now let's look at the developmental model. The underlying philosophy of this model is that people become more susceptible to addiction when human development is stifled or abnormal, usually stemming from early childhood. When it comes to addiction recovery, the developmental model aims to accelerate one's development by increasing awareness to self in relationship to the world and self in relationship to others, recognition of consequences of personal decision-making, enhanced social and emotional maturity, and attention to the bigger picture. All right, the last model to mention is the recovery coaching model. The conventional recovery coaching model that has developed over the last couple decades runs parallel with the rehab model. The more traditional models of recovery coaching combine the Minnesota model with a recovery management model and the harm reduction model. Coaching models tend to incorporate holistic, spiritual, and developmental aspects into their programs, as well as personal guidance and accountability. Conventional recovery coaches hold individuals accountable to the addiction treatment and recovery process, ushering clients back to their counselors and doctors. So, those are some of the mainstream recovery models in society today. I will speak to alternative recovery approaches in a later episode. Next, let's look at the definition for recovery and explore this concept of being in recovery from addiction or other states of suffering. So, recovery defined. Recovery can mean different things, such as a return to a normal state of health, mind, or strength, implying that one has gotten into an abnormal state of mind and body. Or recovery can mean the action or process of regaining control of something lost. Lost referring to loss of self, self-esteem, dignity, vitality, hope, drive, and connection. Recovery can also refer to recouping after trauma, chaos, problems, or a very stressful situation, regaining mental and emotional stability, recovering from familial, relational, social, or environmental challenges and difficulties, rebuilding after physical illness or injury, and or reclaiming oneself in this world after a life transition of any kind. Recovery from addiction means that a person has learned how to live and function soberly without one or more of their primary addictions. By modern-day standards, being in recovery doesn't necessarily mean that a person is free of all their addictions or even all substances. It just means that a person is sober of illicit drugs and alcohol or their primary behavioral addiction. Addiction to things like nicotine, pharmaceutical drugs, caffeine, and sugar do not negate recovery, as these things are socially tolerated or just not counted. But street drugs, alcohol, and other mind-altering substances are counted as relapse. These standards have caused confusion and upset within the recovery community because recovery can mean different things to different people. Additionally, these standards can limit and block a full recovery by overlooking certain harmful things, but then stigmatizing certain good things that could actually help a person in their recovery. In mainstream recovery theory, a person is always in recovery from addiction. There is no cure for addiction. There is only remaining in a state of recovery, reinforced by a recovery program and a recovery culture. Stepping outside the recovering mindset leaves a person vulnerable to relapse. And for some people, this mindset works for them, but for other people, it can feel quite limiting. I would say that a person can mature beyond a particular addiction and the phases of recovery for that addiction. A person does not have to remain in a recovering state inside a particular recovery bubble forever. However, staying in a process of personal work and continuing to evolve are important to avoid complacency and relapse. From the transformational recovery perspective that I teach, recovery is a process of remembering who you are and why you came here, reestablishing your mind-body spiritual connection, and through a daily practice of self-improvement, developing a healthier framework for life beyond addiction. Transformational recovery involves the integration of different parts of oneself back into alignment, balance, and wholeness with the true self. The most important thing that I have learned about addiction is that there is no external solution to addiction. The point of addiction is to commit to a lifelong spiritual path. A note on sobriety, abstinence, and recovery now. Traditionally, the focus in recovery is on sobriety and abstinence. The belief is that recovery and sobriety are synonymous, meaning that if you are not sober, then you are not in recovery. And if you are in recovery, then you are sober. This way of thinking has its pros and cons, so it is worth examining. Now, although sobriety from addiction would be the aim in recovery, and obviously a key defining factor in this process, there are ambiguities that cause tension and confusion within the community, as I mentioned. Most notably, sobriety being defined differently based on social cultural biases, tolerances, and norms, which enable some groups and then stigmatizes other groups. Making recovery and sobriety synonymous means that the process of recovery does not start until a person is able to stay sober. If a person is not able to stay sober, they are no longer in recovery. Relapses are considered setbacks that send a person back to start, often being made to feel that they are not ready yet. Connecting recovery and sobriety insinuates people should be able to get and stay sober by choice and willpower alone, with no preparation or training, and that any work prior to the last relapse does not count. Now, while these things may or may not be stated out loud, it is the general vibe, spoken or not. What I will be showing throughout this series is that transformational recovery is different from sobriety-based recovery. In the process of transformational recovery, one's recovery work can and should begin pre-abstinence. Conscious effort to improve oneself in any active addiction is a prime training ground for honest introspection, strategizing, and learning and growth. Recovery is not solely defined by sobriety, but rather by the incremental steps forward a person takes each day to further their growth and transformation, letting go of one attachment and making one small improvement after another. All efforts count despite relapse. Even though the tests do seem to get harder, with intention and conviction, a person's strategy can become smarter, stronger, and sturdier. All right, moving now into the next section. I'm going to say a few words about the process of recovery and the different stages and phases of recovery, because it is important to understand that a person's needs, vulnerabilities, and challenges are going to be different in early to later stages of recovery. So, recovery process and phases. A process of recovery is necessary and important because addiction weaves itself into your psychological, physical, personal, and social existence, immersing you into the addictive culture. At this point, you become enmeshed with addiction, and addiction becomes enmeshed within you. So, in order to separate yourself from the addiction and disrupt these addictive patterns, you will have to choose some kind of recovery pathway and go through a recovery process. I will speak to recovery pathways in a later episode. Any process of recovery requires a certain level of readiness and willingness to change, some degree of coachability and receptiveness to support and feedback, and structure and accountability to follow through with commitments and stay in process. Any process of recovery requires simplicity and consistency, ongoing practice and integration, and perseverance and determination. And any process of recovery would require a reason why change is more important than not changing. Recovery from addiction begins as soon as a person recognizes a need for change. The next step in the process is making the decision to overcome addiction, followed by better choices to support positive change from that point forward. Recovery happens through a series of conscious and positive choices. The process can begin before, during, or after a person reaches complete abstinence, as the first phase is all about gaining awareness and preparing the mind for change, which can happen pre-abstinence. Turning now to the phases of recovery. The first phase, commonly referred to as the entry phase, covers approximately the first 90 days. The entry recovery phase is often initiated by a motivational crisis or psychic shift of some kind, whereby something changes. The new circumstances force a reality check, causing a person to acknowledge their part in this. Faced with the challenge of the opportunity to change one's way, a person accepts the voyage. Despite the fear, doubt, and resistance to change, a surrender and pledge is made in the name of health and wholeness, truth or consequence, and commitment and faith. The training and work begins with the acceptance of new support, structure, and accountability. Following the entry recovery phase comes the early recovery phase, spanning approximately 90 days to 1 year. The early recovery phase is characterized by a new perspective, a new self-image and attitude, and a new purpose and way of life. To make it past 90 days without falling back into old ways, a person has to move pretty fast into a truer version of themselves, which usually includes a new social network and working a recovery program. Through the tests and trials of early recovery, a person develops awareness, skills, resilience, and discipline. This creates momentum and achievements, which bring about opportunities for learning and growth and help people to become a part of something. Upon reaching about 1 year of sobriety starts the intermediate recovery phase. This is about 1 to 3 years into recovery. Once a person has reached the mid-recovery phase, a new level of commitment must be made within oneself. In this second year of recovery, people branch out and explore new things, causing them to step out of the recovery bubble. This requires deeper trust, integrity, and discipline within oneself. To follow their higher calling and find their place and people in this world, a bigger vision and mission is sought, and thus a bigger commitment is needed. To sustain recovery, a person maintains balance and harmony in their life and engages their work skillfully in the moment it arises. Then comes the long-term recovery phase, which is about 3+ years into recovery and sobriety. Entering long-term recovery, a person has successfully overcome an addiction or something major. They are likely living with more balance, alignment, and wholeness. A person is more tuned in to their intuition and spirituality and more mission-oriented in life. Daily recovery has evolved into a life of ongoing integration and cultivation. Through a daily committed spiritual practice, a person continuously recalibrates to their true north, allowing themselves to face each next challenge with more grace and determination. Thriving in recovery could be synonymous with quality of life. Someone who is transforming themselves through recovery, staying in their process of recovery, and being true to themselves at whatever level or stage they're at. Now, for the final section, I will touch on basic recovery principles and prerequisites that are known throughout the recovery community that I think stand true universally in the process of recovery. So, basic recovery principles and prerequisites. The first to mention, admit that the addiction has become unmanageable and that change requires personal responsibility and dedication to self-improvement. Next to mention, show willingness to see the truth, to get honest with yourself and with others, to accept help and feedback, and to take action in new directions. Next, hone your ability to self-reflect and course correct. Observe personal patterns and their outcomes. Admit mistakes, right your wrongs, and choose better. Next, develop a strategy for recovery, outlining intentions, pressing needs, challenges, cautions, strengths, resources, and personal commitments. Next, create solid connections with positive people. Make clear agreements with your support team. Get your accountability set up, as well as supportive environments and connection to a recovering community. Next, exercise discipline, organization, and consistency with daily health habits, and balance moderation and temperance with desires. Next, identify your personal vested interests in your own recovery and get passionate and excited about living a purpose-driven life or something to keep you inspired in recovery. And lastly, commit to a path of personal development and a step-by-step plan that helps you to improve yourself and make strides in your life every day. So there's a list of recovery basics and prerequisites that you might want to develop if you're stepping into recovery. Now, whether you think that these are easy or hard, really, if you just look at it, the principles to recovering from an addiction or other state of suffering are the same principles to living a wholesome, balanced, and genuine life. So it's up to you. Do you want to get in your process of self-improvement and recovery and continue leveling up through your life? Or do you want to continue on as is and risk the consequences that may come? And with that, this concludes this episode on recovery basics in society today. Thank you for tuning in. I hope that this episode was able to shed some light on the potential for people to recover from things that might feel impossible. To integrate this episode, name 3 recovery basics that you could practice and integrate into your life. And as always, thank you for watching. We will see you in the next episode on interrupting addiction and the supporter's role.